Why has the U.S. government lied to every man, woman, and child about craft that have been detected for decades of unknown origin, unknown occupants, unknown short, medium, and long-term agenda, and of which operates in our biosphere, including our skies, our oceans, and frankly, near-Earth orbit as well, and of which acts with absolute impunity to do whatever it wants, whenever it wants, 365 calendar days a year, including tampering and surveilling weapons of mass destruction. That's what we'll explore today, children. So this video is going to be all about why has there been a UFO cover-up for the past 70 plus years instituted by the US government and other governments aligning with that policy as well. And regarding the Southern accent at the opening, some questions are best not asked because the answer may disturb you. But moving on, we got a lot of work to do. Let's get right into it. As you probably know, I did an interview very recently with Nathan Williams on his podcast with the guest James Fox. And in the following clip, he talks about how this is an issue that most of humanity would want greater insight into, as opposed to a policy that gives everyone an inaccurate impression of the nature of their very universe.
This intelligence guy said to me, James, just recently, a couple weeks ago, he said, James, we don't even know if the public wants to know. And I thought that was, I've never, ever thought that the public would not want to know.
And to drive that point home, here is scientist Gary Nolan from Witness Citizen's YouTube channel going into the interest level of your average human being once they recognize that this enigma is absolutely real.
I mean, it's like, how could you not be interested in this? How could you not ask the next question? And I think that's kind of what the DOD or whoever trying to keep this thing quiet is. They know that once they admit any element of truth about this, the torrents of questions that will come afterwards that demand an answer will be unending. I mean, it really will.
So I went into this in the opening of this video with a kind of a cool Southern accent, if I do say so myself. There are aspects to this enigma that are not comfortable, that are threaded into the literature going back many decades, that are inevitably going to be asked about that very moment when we get official verification that flying saucers, flying triangles, cigars, and various other shapes that people have seen for decades, that have reportedly hovered over ICBM installations, usually surveilling the technology, but sometimes tampering with it. There have been reports of the technology being turned on. There have been reports of the technology being turned off. It would be immediate. The very microsecond this conversation transforms into what it is now, well, we really don't know. We need to do more investigation. We need to do more research to. We lied to you, public. We've known all along. And they're not going to say that, but once they say it's real, what's the immediate objective, rational interpretation? It's that they've known all along. They didn't find out in 2004 when Commander David Fravor intercepted a Tic Tac UAP. They found out way prior to that And so you open up this can of worms that no government in their right mind wants to contend with. If I was a government official, I wouldn't want to contend with that. It makes you look bad. It makes you look like liars. It makes you look incompetent. And perhaps worst of all, you don't have answers because you don't know where these technologies originate from. You don't know who is behind the wheel, nor do you know what their agenda is. And simultaneously, you have to concede that their technological capabilities far and away exceeds anything any nation state on this globe has access to. They can do whatever they want, whenever they want, with impunity. And there might be a dark side to this reality. Whether that dark side is a reflection of a negative intent or just a byproduct of the phenomena itself, we can debate that when the time comes. But this is a can of worms, son, no government wants to contend with. And the questions, like Gary Nolan stated, would indeed be unceasing and be relentless. We would step foot into a whole new world. And I will end this segment with saying, if humanity wants to know really badly, and you know the questions would be unceasing, you don't use that truth as justification to lie and obfuscate. Push the can down the road and avoid your responsibility. Not in a democracy. To be withheld information of this gravity is not freedom. That's subjugation. That's tyranny. We have a right to know. And I think that's where this is all headed. Because secrets have shelf lives. And this secret is not like fine French wine that just gets better with time. It's like cabbage sitting in your fridge for months that spoils. The worse, the longer the US government and other governments pretend like they don't know what's going on, the worse the lie becomes. The more blowback is possible, the more anger, the more repercussions. Now, of course, this is all predicated on me being right about UFOs. And if you know anything about me, I acknowledge I could be wrong, but I call it like I see it. So in my opinion, there is a lot of glue that holds the UFO cover-up together and has facilitated it persisting for so many decades. Governments not wanting to answer questions on this enigma when they don't have answers is one reason, one component of that glue that has kept the status quo maintaining itself. But here's another explanation that is absolutely fascinating. And I never heard this one prior to Luis Elizondo speaking about it in the following clip. This is from Kurt Jaimungal's podcast, Theories of Everything, and the totality of this interview will be linked in the description below.
What if there was knowledge, Kurt, that was so volatile, so earth-shattering, that the mere knowledge of that getting out could predicate an action that could potentially threaten the entire species? Now, what do I mean by that? For just a moment, take off the scientific hat, take off your humanitarian hat, take off your philanthropic hat, and put on a hat of national security. We just talked about the fact that there's no indication that these things have been here to help us. Okay, so there's really only three possibilities: they're benign, or if you will, benevolent, or two, they are malevolent, they're here to hurt us, or three, they're just here to observe us, and they're capable of doing both good and bad like us. Well, if you were to put on your national security hat for a second, let's say you're a general from the 1950s or 60s, and your job is to protect America and all things good and great, and the height of the Cold War, and you've got the Soviet bear across there, and things are pretty tough, right? And nuclear proliferation is a real thing. Now, you have information that there is something here that can outperform anything you have. And really, anything you have is rather ineffective from a national security perspective. And there's a thing out there, and it doesn't show that it's being benevolent. So it's only one of two other options: either malevolent or it's like us. And we see this very careful ISR surveillance of our nuclear equities. It's interested in nuclear equities. Well, some may look at that as what we call preparation for the battlefield. Okay. And let's just say hypothetically, there's a 10% chance, US has a 10% chance that these things are bad, or one day they're going to come here in force, and they're looking at us, right? Remember, you're putting on your national security hat. So forget about everything else for a moment. Your job is to be paranoid. And there's a small remote chance that these things are not good. And maybe there is a plan for these things at some point to come in force in 50 years from now. And if the mere fact you have this conversation with the American people, what's going to happen? Well, the American people are going to start getting prepared. Well, I can tell you in real life combat situations, when we send in long range surveillance LRS teams, behind enemy lines, the moment the enemy finds out that we know, that they know we're there, the element of surprise is over. And so ultimately, hypothetically, imagine a scenario where maybe we had 50 years to prepare for something, but now that the cat's out of the bag, that existential action will happen tomorrow. And by the way, we're not ready for it. We're not prepared for it. We don't have a countermeasure. We don't have a capability to counter this. And so from a very real perspective, a national security perspective, the mere fact that you are acknowledging the existence of something may predicate an action or an act that you're not prepared to have right now. And so I encourage you and your listeners to just for a moment, I'm not asking you to be a national security person, but I'm asking you to suspend your personal beliefs right now for just a moment and put yourself in somebody else's shoes who does feel that way, right? Now, what do? If the mere fact of talking about this could potentially cause a reaction that you're not ready for as a country, as a civilization, right? Maybe that's the reason why you decide to only brief certain presidents who have a background in intelligence. Maybe they were former directors of CIA, but the other presidents who are career politicians will be, they're here today, gone in 4 years. Maybe you can't even risk telling them. And so maybe the reason why this has been kept secret so long is actually, in a weird sense, some sort of sense of patriotism by people. And maybe that's how they justify it. And I'll leave that at that as a counterpoint of forcing people to think maybe a little bit non-traditionally. Now, do I think if that happened to ever be the case, that's a good explanation? No. I still think that we have to be honest with the American people.
If it wasn't clear, this is, of course, a complete hypothetical. That is, people within the national security apparatus, in an abundance of caution, would not want disclosure in the event that humanity collectively learning about this presence could elicit an attack from this presence, because the advantage of surprise attack would be removed, and therefore they would be in a position, hypothetically, where they'd have to attack now to prevent preparation by humanity to theoretically prepare for this presence potential threat scenario. And very interestingly, as was relayed by Twitter user Tiny Klaus, Chris Mellon actually alluded to this concept in an article he wrote on February 14th titled "Statement for the Press and Public Regarding Recent UAP Shootdowns." And here's the excerpt. "The good news is that awareness is rising regarding the UAP issue, and we have not yet suffered any acts of kinetic aggression or hostility from UAP. The public should be more relieved than alarmed, as we are finally taking the steps necessary to more effectively defend and control U.S. airspace." Now, this concept, I have to admit, if you're paid to be paranoid and you have an intimate clarity on how real this phenomena is, how prevalent it is, and the extraordinary capabilities that it has, including turning off your nuclear ICBM weaponry and turning them on, seeing that on a scientific level, even if it's insulated from the rest of the world, would put the fear of God in you if your responsibility was national security. And so these extreme realities that the national security people had to deal with would only fuel paranoia. And so if the concept is disclosure could elicit an attack from this phenomena, even if it's a remote possibility, we are not going to test that possibility. That may have been what went through their minds. And of course, my perspective, in accordance with my alien AI hypothesis, is that governments were baited into the cover-up. But that's beyond the scope of this conversation we're having. Now, when you look at the UFO historical record and you look at all the accounts of the men in black, which ultimately are just people that dress in suits that work for some government agency and are trying to keep the spread of this knowledge of UAP from getting into the mainstream, now that begins to make sense. From this perspective, it begins to make sense why there would be men in black, which would be an outcrop of people in power dealing with this secrecy that are basically scared shitless of it and want to take all the precautions in the world because they just don't have the answers. With, for example, the question, what is going to happen when disclosure occurs? This phenomena is real. We know it's real. What if the behavior of this phenomena alters as a result of disclosure? Just the very mere fact that that's a possibility means we are not going there. We are going to institute a cover-up, and we are going to maintain this cover-up. Now, look, I'm not saying this is if this is one of the motivations for the cover-up, and I think it's likely that it is because it makes so much sense. I'm not saying it's the only motivation. Like I mentioned earlier, I think there's a lot of different components to that glue that has maintained this cover-up. But this is probably an important one. But the other side of the argument is, well, if you keep covering this up, now you're putting the health of the republic in jeopardy. Do you want to lose your country over this secrecy? You keep lying to those you're supposed to serve of something of this gravity that also has potentially catastrophic negative potentials. And I agree with Luis Elizondo. You have to be clear with the American public because we have a right to know that this presence is real. Okay, so to wrap this video up, we went over 2 reasons so far why there is a cover-up on the UFO reality. One is that governments don't want to be in a position where they have to answer myriad of questions of which they don't have answers to, and they know that the moment this conversation transforms from there's a lot of interesting things going on, let's see what it's all about, to oh yeah, no, we have forensic proof that we're not alone and we're being engaged. Once that happens, the floodgate of questions will open up, and it will be relentless and it will be persistent, and no government in their right mind wants to have to contend with that. The second reason of why this is the situation we've been going through for 70 plus years is the proposition that once this enters the mainstream, that we're not alone, we're being engaged, there's a remote possibility, at least in the minds of potentially some national security operators, is that the phenomena may change its course of action and may perceive us collectively knowing scientifically it exists as a threat to a plan the phenomena may have to invade us because the element of surprise has now been removed. And now that the element of surprise has been removed, now they're going to want to speed up their plan and engage in a kinetic action much sooner rather than later. Okay, now the third reason we're going to cover is intransigence of government officials as well. Oh, thank you for that. Sorry about that. Intransigence of government officials and the seduction of power in knowing you have this truth, this mysterious truth about reality, knowing that the moment it's released, it would transform all of humanity. But there is a seduction, there is a pridefulness, an ego trip, if you will, to have this knowledge all to yourself and not sharing it with the rest of the world. I do believe that is a component of the secrecy. I do believe there is and also like this idea that we're the ones that are the gatekeepers, the watchers, the benevolent protectors of humanity. We'll take on this burden. We don't want the rest of humanity to have to deal with it, right? There's all these mental gymnastics that are probably expressing themselves. I'm going to go out there and tell these people, I'm making a video. This is wrong. Do you realize the operation going on right now? How dare you? Sorry about that. So there's this egotistical trip. Maybe the people that are doing these actions in their mind don't even know how egotistical it is, but they think they're protecting humanity. When what they're really doing, in my opinion, particularly at this moment, right? Maybe during the Cold War, it would have been too much on the plate of humanity. That could be argued whether that's true or not, but by now, come on. You know, you're flesh and blood just like every other human being. You're not some special creature. You're not Neo. I'm Neo. You're flesh and blood just like every other human being. That was a joke. And so there's a lot of things going on, I think, that leads to a reluctancy. And who doesn't want to feel like they're protecting humanity from themselves, if you will? Who doesn't want to feel like, oh, we'll take care of this burden. We don't want you to have this burden. No, we all want to know the truth. The burden exists, whether we're cognizant of it or not. You could tell a child that they're never going to die. You could protect a child from the knowledge of death. But that child's still going to die. So you removing that reality from their psychology doesn't protect them. It merely deludes them. So basically, humanity just wants this delusion to be removed because humanity wants the truth. You can do a poll. Do a poll of all 8 billion of us. The vast majority of us will say, if this presence is here, yes, we want to know, as opposed to being deluded. Now, here's an article that was published in May of 2022 in Politico by Brian Bender, titled, "A Skull and Bones Type Vibe. Spy Agencies Grapple with How Much to Share at UFO Hearing." And now this gets into this secret society kind of mentality that I do think likely exists on some level and form within some circles that are in the loop of this secrecy and are reluctant to share it with the rest of 8 billion of us. Here's a quote from that article. As Congress prepares to hold the first public hearing on UFOs in half a century, the Pentagon and intelligence agencies are feuding internally over how much to cooperate with demands to investigate and share what they know, according to current and former national security officials. Pentagon officials are under increasing pressure to carry out Congress's recent mandate to establish a permanent effort to coordinate research into reports of highly advanced aircraft of unknown origin intruding into protected airspace. Here's another citation. The intelligence official described another faction inside military and intel agencies, quote, that takes this subject very seriously and is protective of UFO, UAP-related data. Quote, they fetishize their secret society, the official said. It's kind of a skull and bones type vibe. They take it seriously, but they have no accountability, zero. There is a whole group of us that know in great detail this subject, a lot of which has not been reported to Congress because of security issues. So about 3 years ago, I did a video on why there's a UAP cover-up. And I reviewed that video, and I think this is a stronger one, although I covered reasons for the cover-up in the previous video that didn't get covered in this one. But it's an interesting topic, and I think as we get closer and closer to more UFO transparency, society, journalists, and the public will explore this conundrum, this mystery, this topic much more in depth. Why governments chose the path they did in reference to this scientific enigma. Please do not forget to subscribe. And if you'd like to support this channel, you can check out my merch shop where I sell t-shirts. You can become a patron. You can become a YouTube member. You can give me a one-time donation. All those potentialities are in the description below. Or you can just slap a like on this bad boy and I will appreciate it so much. You're still watching, aren't you? I love it. If you're still watching now so that I can feel warm and fuzzy on the inside, put in the comment section below the word nuisance. Nuisance. I appreciate you so much, and I will see you in the next episode. Special thanks to all patrons, YouTube members, those that have bought merch, those that have given me a one-time donation. I couldn't do without you. Thank you so much. See you in the next episode.